Reading 80 from the Psychological Commentaries on the Teachings of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Dr. Maurice Nicoll, Volume 1. Birdlip, July 9th, 1943. Commentary on Self-Observation and Eyes 2. Let us all understand that in order to renew the force and feeling of this work, we must always return to fundamentals as the source. Last time, we began to speak again of one of the fundamental teachings in this work, namely, that this work, in its practical application, begins with self-observation. You must not assume that you already know what is meant by this term, self-observation, which has such depths of meaning. People sometimes say, "Oh yes, all this is nothing new to me. I have always observed myself." And yet they remain as they are. Why? Because they imagine that they already know everything about themselves, and so that they have no need for self-knowledge. All this is illusion, sheer imagination. To imagine one knows oneself is to be a slave to one of the powerful illusions that keep humanity asleep. Let us speak for a moment about imagination. Everyone imagines he knows himself. Now, the peculiar thing about imagination lies in this fact, that if you imagine you are something or have something, you no longer wish for it. For example, if you imagine you know yourself, then you will not seek to find out how you can gain self-knowledge. So you will make no real attempt to practice self-observation. You will both take yourself for granted and imagine you know yourself already. You will go about behaving as you always behave, imagining that you do everything consciously. In that case, you will never be able to set up the inner struggle between yes and no that is the basis of practical work on oneself and the source of change of being. Now, it is very difficult to discern even a single thing about oneself, and this is due to more reasons than one. For example, the whole natural movement of ourselves must be turned completely round in order to observe ourselves. Naturally speaking, we look out through our external senses at that aspect of the world they register according to their very limited powers. This external scene, registered by sense, full of people and things, brightly colored, we suppose is the sum total of what we call the real, or the existing, or in brief, reality. But reality is not confined to the small range of our senses and does not only lie outside us in the show of life. There is the reality of our inner thoughts and feelings and desires and sufferings. That is, there is a reality even more real than any external reality transmitted by the senses, and which can only be penetrated by each one himself. Outer reality is common to us all, but inner reality is individually approached. This other inner reality, to which each person has his own access, lies invisibly within us. It is to this invisible inner reality in which we dwell psychologically or psychically, this inner confusion, that the work applies. Science turned outwards via the senses seeks how to conquer nature. This work is about conquering oneself, about self-mastery. So it begins with observing, not external nature, but oneself. But all kinds of psychological difficulties arise here, and in this respect, we all have very defective sight. That is, insight as distinct from outsight. And one of these difficulties is due to imagination. We imagine we see ourselves and know ourselves thoroughly, and this prevents us from awaking to the realization of what real self-observation means, and of what it means to really begin to know oneself. Let us remember that self-knowledge from most ancient times was regarded as the highest knowledge. All esoteric teaching speaks of self-knowledge. Let us hear again the work speaking to us about imagination and the part it plays in life in preventing us from changing our being. The work says, "There are 1,000 things which prevent a man from awakening, which keep him in the power of his imagination and dreams. In order to act consciously with the intention of awakening, it is necessary to know the forces which keep man in a state of sleep. First of all, it must be realized that the sleep in which man exists on this earth is not normal, but hypnotic sleep. Man is hypnotized, and this hypnotic state is continually maintained and strengthened in him. One would think that there are forces for whom it is useful and profitable to keep man in a hypnotic sleep state and prevent him from seeing the truth and understanding his position. There is an Eastern tale which speaks of a very rich magician who had a great many sheep. But at the same time, this magician was very mean. He did not want to hire shepherds, nor did he want to erect a fence about the pasture where his sheep were grazing. The sheep, consequently, often wandered into the forest, fell into ravines, and so on, and above all they ran away, for they knew that the magician wanted their flesh and skins, and they did not like. And this they did not like. At last the magician found a remedy. He hypnotized his sheep and suggested to them, first of all, that they were immortal, and that no harm was being done to them when they were skinned. That on the contrary, it would be very good for them and even pleasant. Secondly, he suggested that the magician was a good master who loved his flock so much that he was ready to do anything in the world for them. And in the third place, he suggested to them that if anything at all were going to happen to them, it was not going to happen just then, at any rate not that day, and therefore they had no need to think about it. Further, the magician suggested to his sheep that they were not sheep at all. To some, he suggested that they were lions, to others that they were eagles, to others that they were men, and to others that they were magicians. And after this, all cares and worries about the sheep came to an end. They never ran away again, but quietly awaited the time when the magician would require their flesh and skins. This tale is a very good illustration of man's position. In so-called occult literature, you have probably met with the expression Kundalini, the fire of Kundalini, or the serpent of Kundalini. This expression is often used to designate some kind of strange force which is present in man and which can be awakened. But none of the known theories gives the right explanation of the force of Kundalini. Sometimes it is connected with sex energy, that is, with the idea of the possibility of using sex energy for other purposes. This latter idea is entirely wrong because Kundalini is not anything desirable or useful for man's development. It is very curious how these so-called occultists have got hold of the word from somewhere but have completely altered its meaning. And from a very dangerous and terrible thing, they have made something to be hoped for and to be waited for as some blessing. In reality, Kundalini is the power of the imagination, the power of fantasy, which takes the place of a real function. When a man dreams instead of acting, when his dreams take the place of reality, when a man imagines himself to be an eagle, a lion, a man, or a magician, it is the force of Kundalini acting in him. Kundalini can act in all centers, and with its help, all the centers can be satisfied with the imaginary instead of the real. A sheep, which considers itself a lion or a magician, lives under the power of Kundalini. Kundalini is a force put into men in order to keep them in their present state. If men could really see their true position and could understand the horror of it, they would be unable to remain where they are, even for a second. They would begin to seek a way out, and they would quickly find it, because there is a way out. But men fail to see it simply because they are hypnotized. Kundalini is the force that keeps them in a hypnotic state. To awaken for man means to be dehypnotized. In this lies the chief difficulty, and in this lies also the guarantee of its possibility, for there is no organic reason for sleep, and man can awaken. Theoretically he can, but practically it is almost impossible because of the psychological forces acting on man. As soon as he awakens for a moment and opens his eyes, all these forces that caused him to fall asleep begin to act on him with trifold energy, tenfold energy, and he immediately falls asleep again, very often dreaming that he is awake or is awakening. There are certain states in ordinary sleep in which a man wants to waken but cannot. He tells himself that he is awake, but in reality he continues to sleep, and this can happen several times before he finally awakes. But in ordinary sleep, once he is awake, he is in a different state. In hypnotic sleep, the case is otherwise. There are no objective characteristics. At any rate, not at the beginning of awakening. A man cannot pinch himself in order to make sure that he is not asleep. Only a man who fully realizes the difficulty of awakening can understand the necessity of long and hard work in order to awake. In the above quotation, you will see how much importance is attached to imagination and in what sense it is used. Imagination is therefore defined in the work as that which replaces reality. Imagination can satisfy all centers, so man can be satisfied with the imaginary instead of the real. It is for this reason that the work so often speaks about imagination and about the necessity for struggling with it. As you know, in the practical instructions given by the work as regards what one must struggle against, imagination is mentioned. However, it usually takes a considerable time before a person in the work begins to observe his imagination. And there are also many difficulties connected with observing imagination, one of which is that as soon as you try to observe it, it stops. That is, as soon as you get into directed attention, imagination ceases. I suppose that few of us yet have really thought about how we would care to face the possibility of the whole of our inner psychical life of secret thought and feeling being laid bare to the observation of other people. Here, in our life on earth, this is mercifully hidden from others. But at the same time, is individually accessible to each of us. This is the direction of the work, on its practical side, to see by direct, uncritical self-observation what exists in oneself, what thoughts and feelings and so on one identifies with. But in self-observation, in the work sense, it is necessary to observe facts about oneself. Now, most of us so excuse ourselves and are so much under the pleasant and subtle activity of self-justifying in cooperation with imagination that we never really register any distinct facts about ourselves. For example, if we are mean, we really do not observe it as a fact. Others may, but we find all sorts of reasons in excuse. Or let us take ourselves from the angle of how we speak unpleasantly about one another. We do not register the fact by direct and real self-observation. We allow it to go on, chiefly because we like it, and it is so very easy, and if accused of it, we probably smile in that terrible way we do at such a time. Why are we so incapable of registering facts about ourselves? One great reason is that imagination of ourselves prevents us. So we cannot see anything real, any real facts about ourselves, save very dimly. Our imagination, or state of hypnosis, prevents any real direct observation. We imagine we are, so to speak, eagles or lions, or let us say, respectable and nice people, and cannot see through the mists of self-imagination that we are nothing of the kind. But all these ideas, all these forms of imagination under which everyone lives, are different examples of Kundalini, and the force it exerts on mankind to keep up the state of sleep that characterizes humanity on this earth. People are not what they imagine, nor is anything in life what it pretends to be. Certainly, people may begin to see that this is so as they get older, and then, just when this work is necessary for them, as a rule, they become negative and feel frustrated. You have all heard that the work teaches us that we are in the power of imaginary I, and that this is the source of most of our troubles. This I, or this feeling or idea of oneself, is composed of imagination. Do not think for a moment that imagination is nothing. Nothing but imagination, as the saying goes. You have seen what the work says about imagination. It is the most powerful force acting on mankind. It is a definite and terrible thing, not a mere nothing. To say that a person is suffering from imagination is to say that that person is suffering from a very powerful, intractable, and dangerous force. Apart from what was said last time about self-observation and its meaning and object, this can be added. One of the objects of self-observation is to break down imagination of oneself, that is, imaginary I. One is not what one imagines one is. Now, imagination has no real memory, but self-observation is to create a special and real memory, a conscious memory, a memory that imagination cannot escape from. Self-observation is to destroy imagination, that is, to create a memory that fights with unreal, sentimental, and imaginary memory. If you only possess the unreal memory of imagination, you live in the ideal fantasies of imaginary I, and never see that anything is wrong with you. Others are wrong, not you. But what are you really like in yourself? What eyes control you? What eyes govern your life? What eyes do you consent to? Can you bear to break yourself up into different eyes and see what they say and do, and see what they think and feel? This is to break up the power of imagination. This is to register unpleasant facts about yourself. Can you move on the surface of your own waters? As it says in the account of the beginning of personal esoteric work in the first chapter of Genesis. You remember how our ordinary state of sleep is described. Quote, "And the earth was waste, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved on the face of the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light,' End quote. What is light? It is esotericism. It is esoteric ideas. It is the ideas of this work, which is esotericism. When a man who has right magnetic center first meets the ideas of this work, he is himself the earth that was waste and darkness. Self-observation done sincerely from the knowledge of the ideas of this work lets in light into this inner darkness, this inner chaos of oneself. That is how self-observation is defined in the work. For it says that self-observation lets in light into oneself and adds that many things can take place in darkness, just like certain chemical processes which cannot take place in the presence of light. Light is consciousness. This is the beginning of that possible inner transformation of man that all esoteric teaching, including the Gospels and this work, is always speaking about through the centuries. Having spoken of self-observation from the standpoint of some of the greater ideas of the work, let us now speak of it on the scale on which the last paper was written. In the last talk, amongst other things, it was said that to observe oneself, it is necessary to divide oneself into an observing and an observed side, and that the feeling of I, or consciousness, must be given more and more to the observing side. That is, observing I must be given as far as possible the feeling of I at the moment, and the observed side given the feeling of not I. You walk about in life observing houses and people and trees and so on, and do not necessarily connect the feeling of I with them. They are not I to you. But the same division must be made internally. When you observe internally, what you observe internally is not I. In the same way as the houses, people, etc., you observe externally are clearly not I. We are not identified with everything we see outside us, but ordinarily we are identified with everything that takes place inside us, with every thought, mood, desire, and so on. Self-observation in the work sense is to separate observing I from what is observed in oneself. For instance, you can observe the emotion of the beginning of anger. You can observe the thoughts connected with it. If your consciousness of the feeling of I is stronger in observing I than in what observes, then your anger and the thoughts accompanying it will not have full power over you. The whole inner event may die away. But let us suppose that some self-justifying I comes on to the scene that says your anger is right. What then happens? Answer that for yourselves. If you have never really observed yourself, then you will not be able to answer. But if you have, you will know exactly what happens. But the difficulty mentioned already remains. Merely everyone imagines he or she is one person, a unity, and cannot realize that he is not one person. And everyone imagines he knows himself. It requires long work and great sincerity, and particularly great evaluation of the work and its meaning, to realize that you are not one but many I's. Even your very pride will prevent you, unless you feel the existence of something greater than your pride. The doctrine of many I's is a stumbling block to everyone. Yet it is true, and is the secret that begins to make change of oneself possible. Now remember that if you identify with an I in you, you give it force and you give it the sanction of yourself. That is, you sign its checks in your name. Surely some of you must recognize unpleasant, or rather evil-minded eyes. Then, if you identify with them, they become you. You will them. As soon as you extend your will to possess something, as soon as you take something into your desire, then it is the same as yourself, and so it works in you as yourself, and you believe it. Now, I will quote this question. How can we make use of the observations we have made on ourselves? This is a very interesting question. I would like to hear what you think of this.